My childhood friend Asher Beaumont seemed to have taken a special interest in the new girl at school. Everyone was saying that the aloof heartthrob had finally fallen for someone. That day, the new girl and I were both trapped in a fire. Without hesitation, he picked up the new girl and left. My 7 years of secret love finally came to an end. But later, when another boy confessed his feelings for me, Asher grabbed my wrist tightly, his voice strained. Moved on so quickly? I thought you liked me. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. I waited for over half an hour in the sun outside the lecture hall before Asher finally emerged. Asher! I called out, running up to him. He raised his hand and gently touched my flushed cheek with the back of it, frowning. How long have you been waiting here? Just over half an hour. Asher grabbed my wrist and pulled me towards a nearby gazebo. Aren't you worried about getting sunburnt? He scoffed lazily, cupping my face with both hands to cool me down. I nuzzled his cool hands contentedly before speaking. We don't have classes on Saturday. Shall we go to the oceanarium? What Asher didn't know was that I planned to confess my feelings for him that day. His hands paused. I've already made plans with someone else on Saturday. You should find someone else to go with. A sense of foreboding rose within me. I tentatively asked, who have you made plans with? Fiona Hawthorne. This was a name I'd been hearing frequently from Asher lately. She was his junior in the same department. Recently, there had been many rumors circulating about her and Asher. The typically aloof Asher, who had always been equally cold to everyone, had been showing an unusual amount of care towards this particular underclassman. Everyone was saying that the department's most eligible bachelor, who had remained unattached for 3 years, had finally fallen for someone. Watching Asher's retreating back, I suddenly had a feeling. The confession I had so carefully prepared was destined to end in failure. On Saturday, I went to the oceanarium alone as planned. However, I didn't expect to run into Asher and Fiona there. What are you doing here? Asher looked up at me. I noticed they were both wearing matching dolphin bracelets, seemingly a couple set. I forced a smile. I told you a few days ago that I was coming to the oceanarium. My tone must have been off because Asher's face darkened and he gave me a reproachful look. As if asking, what are you playing at? Fiona blinked at me. Hey, why don't we look around together? Before I could refuse, she linked her arm with mine familiarly. Moments later, I regretted not declining immediately. As we passed a booth, Fiona and Asher were stopped. The vendor looked at the two of them and said with a smile, couples participating in our activity can get a free limited edition dolphin plush. The atmosphere instantly became awkward. The vendor likely assumed they were a couple because they both wore dolphin bracelets, while I didn't. Fiona tugged on Asher's sleeve. Sorry, he's mistaken, she said to Asher. Asher asked her, do you like that plush toy? Fiona didn't say anything, just stared at the toy with sparkling eyes. Then, I watched as Asher agreed to participate in the vendor's activity. The activity was quite simple. The man just had to carry the woman in a bridal style around the hall once. I stood to the side, watching Asher effortlessly lift Fiona. People around us cheered quietly. Some even took out their phones to secretly snap photos. Asher noticed and pulled Fiona closer, shielding her face from the cameras. He then frowned disapprovingly at those taking pictures. His protective intent was obvious. I felt a lump in my throat. Inappropriately, I recalled that in the 10 years I'd known Asher, he had never once carried or piggybacked me. In 6th form, when I sprained my ankle, he only waited with me for my dad to pick me up. He had said casually, "Don't expect me to carry you home." I don't carry any girl except my girlfriend. I wondered if he had forgotten what he said then, or if he already considered Fiona his girlfriend. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't help thinking about the long-awaited dolphin show. I had to endure the slight tightness in my chest and try to ignore the two people beside me. Asher knew that I loved dolphins too. But he didn't even ask if I wanted that plush toy. During the performance, when the dolphins leapt up and plunged back into the pool, they splashed a huge wave of water. The three of us were sitting closest and had no time to dodge. Asher stood between Fiona and me, instinctively shielding Fiona from most of the water. I, on the other hand, was completely drenched. Are you all right? Did you get splashed? Asher anxiously looked at Fiona, ignoring the water on himself. The pool water is cold. You'll catch a cold if you're wet. Fiona hurriedly pulled out some tissues and started wiping Asher's forehead. I'm fine, Asher. You should dry yourself quickly. It wasn't until a staff member came running with a towel for me that they noticed. I'm so sorry, miss. The barrier's been faulty recently and didn't block the water. Thank you, I said as I took the towel. Only then did Asher and Fiona turn to look at me, seemingly just realizing that I was soaked too. Aileen, do you need some tissues? Fiona asked tentatively. I ignored her and continued drying myself. Aileen, didn't you hear Fiona talking to you? Asher questioned me sternly. I took a deep breath, holding back the stinging in my eyes. I looked straight at Asher. I already have a towel. Can't you see whether I need tissues or not? Asher's gaze turned cold. What's your problem? Fiona just asked you a question. What's wrong with that? Can you stop with your princess attitude? His tone was icy, tinged with mockery. No one should spoil you except your parents. Apologize, Asher commanded, looking at me impassively. Fiona chimed in at the right moment. It's all right. She said to Asher, feigning nonchalance, I've been through this all my life. Because of my family's financial situation, teachers and classmates looked down on me. Being excluded and bullied was common. Don't bother about it, Asher. I'm used to it anyway. Asher's expression darkened, about to say something more. Fiona quickly interrupted, Asher, your clothes are all wet. Let me help you dry them. With that, the two left without a glance at me, Fiona pulling Asher away. I stood there, the water dripping from my hair mixing with tears as they slid down my face. I wiped my face, pretending to dry it, and silently walked out of the oceanarium. Perhaps it was due to the sudden change in weather that day, with the cold wind blowing incessantly. After returning home, I developed a high fever. I didn't go back to school until Monday. During that time, Asher called me once, but I missed it. I also didn't reply to his WhatsApp messages. Eventually, he came directly to my house. He entered my room with familiar ease. Has your fever gone down? He asked, moving as if to feel my forehead. I didn't have any unrealistic expectations that he had come to check on my condition. But I also didn't expect him to come to reprimand me. I turned my head to the side, avoiding his touch. It's nothing now, I said. Did you need something? His hand paused midair. Aileen, what do you mean? Asher leaned against the wardrobe, looking down at me. Don't tell me you're still angry about the other day, he said. What right do you have to be angry? Are we the ones who did something wrong? I suddenly felt utterly exhausted. Then what do you want? I asked. I knew I was in the wrong. My mistake was agreeing to go to the oceanarium with them. Hearing this, Asher's expression remained unchanged. He didn't let me off. After you've recovered, go apologize to Fiona yourself. Why should I? I asked. My hand, hidden under the duvet, clenched tightly. Asher gave a soft laugh. Because your parents need a favor from my family right now. They're asking my dad to buy out your nearly bankrupt company. You wouldn't want me to discuss this small matter directly with your parents, would you? I sat up, staring at him without blinking. Tears began to flow uncontrollably down my cheeks. Asher, we've known each other for 10 years. Are you really going to force me over this? He frowned slightly, turning his face away. Because of your baseless anger that day, Fiona was afraid you were upset. She didn't dry herself properly before coming to find you, and ended up catching a cold when she got back. She's been taking medicine for 3 days. Don't you think you should take responsibility for that? Hearing this, I couldn't shed another tear. I had a fever for 3 days. But in Asher's eyes, that was nothing compared to his junior's cold. He even wanted to blame me for it. I had no choice. If I didn't agree to apologize, he would just get my parents to force me to do it anyway. I blinked and nodded. I understand. Asher looked at me for a moment, his tone suddenly softening. Aileen, I don't mean anything by it. I just hope you can learn to take responsibility for your actions. I didn't say anything more, hiding myself under the duvet, shutting out all the sounds I didn't want to hear. After recovering from my illness and returning to school, I happened to run into Asher and Fiona. I walked straight up to Fiona and looked at her earnestly. I'm sorry, Fiona. I shouldn't have lost my temper with you that day. I didn't control my anger well. Fiona smiled gently. It's all right, Aileen. I don't mind these things. I'm used to it anyway. This was the second time she emphasized that she was used to being mistreated. Whether intentional or not, I couldn't be bothered to dwell on it anymore. I gave her a perfunctory smile and was about to leave. Asher grabbed my wrist as I passed by. Feeling better? I immediately pulled away, taking a step back. Yes. My tone was calm. I thought perhaps I had been delusional before, believing that Asher treated me differently. I shouldn't have had expectations. Asher stared at me, his eyes unreadable. What's wrong with you? I shook my head, my voice uncontrollably formal and polite. Nothing. I need to go to the library. I won't disturb you too. Now that I couldn't afford to offend Asher, I might as well avoid him. Asher's expression turned impatient. What are you being so passive-aggressive about? I didn't quite understand why Asher was still unhappy when I was graciously giving them space to be alone. Behind him, Fiona's gaze fell on me, seemingly dark for a moment. Before I could get a closer look, Asher spoke again. You haven't changed at all. You'll never learn to respect others. He looked at me with disappointment, then turned and left with Fiona. For a while after that, I didn't initiate contact with Asher once. Neither did he, probably busy accompanying Fiona. For the first few days, I was still upset. Occasionally, I would think of the times when Asher and I were once so close. And how he truly was good to me then. I thought this Cold War would go on indefinitely, with Asher and I having no more interactions. But Fiona was not satisfied with just that. It was Friday night. I left the library at 10:30 p.m. The street was almost deserted. That day wasn't particularly eventful until I stumbled upon a bullying scene. Two girls were restraining Fiona, while another was frantically slapping her face. The attacker was ranting furiously. Why are you such a snitch? What's wrong with me bringing my boyfriend back to the dorm? Did you really have to go and tell the tutor? How does it affect you? Fiona's face seemed to have swollen from the slaps. This was the only route back to my dormitory, so I hid nearby. I felt utterly indifferent. I just hoped they would finish quickly so I could go back. Fortunately, after a few minutes, seeing that Fiona wasn't fighting back, they calmed down. They left her there and the three of them walked away. Seen enough? Fiona, sitting on the ground, suddenly spoke up. I calmly stepped out. I'm not interested in your affairs, I'm just passing by. She chuckled lightly. Do you really think she hit me because I snitched to the tutor? Fiona gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She's angry because her boyfriend was flirting with me. I'm not upset, she said. At least it proves that just by standing there, I have a bunch of boys falling over themselves to flirt with me. Including Asher Beaumont, she said with a smile. A chill ran through my heart. It's none of my business. Fiona clearly wasn't as innocent as she appeared on the surface. I didn't want to hear her bizarre theories. Just as I was about to turn and leave, she suddenly went mad, stood up, ran over and grabbed me. You like Asher, don't you? What can you do? But he likes me. She looked at me, smiling with curved lips. I was struck at my weak point and shook her off. Are you mental? Fiona suddenly seemed to lose her balance and fell to the ground. I was stunned for a moment. I hadn't pushed her that hard. Aileen! I froze. The owner of the voice behind me was all too familiar. Asher passed by me and ran to Fiona's side, helping her up. He slowly brushed Fiona's hair aside, seeing the injuries on her face. Then he looked at me with a particularly grim expression. This was too melodramatic. I didn't hit her. Don't look at me like that. Asher ignored my words and asked Fiona in a low voice, "Did she do this to you?" Fiona smiled sadly, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's all right, Asher." She indirectly confirmed it. I laughed bitterly. "Believe what you want." Just as I was about to leave, Asher blocked my path. "I won't apologize, Asher." "Why should I apologize for something I didn't do?" His voice was devoid of any emotion. "Fine." I was stunned, sensing something wasn't right. "Fiona, come here," he called. "Hit her back," Asher said. I stared intently at Asher, confirming again and again, was this really the childhood friend I grew up with? Asher looked down at me. "Your parents have spoiled you too much, turning you into someone who even bullies others." My hands clenched tightly at my sides, my face pale. "Do you think I could have beaten her up like this all by myself?" But he didn't believe me at all, thinking I was just making excuses. His voice was utterly cold. "I don't want to use force on you," he said to me. I looked at Fiona woodenly and asked hoarsely, "What exactly do you want?" Fiona burst into tears without warning. She walked up to me and slapped me across the face. "You're rich, you're a young lady. I'm so poor I can barely scrape together my tuition fees. If you hit me, how dare I hit back? Could I afford your medical bills? If you're still holding a grudge about that day at the oceanarium, just say it. You and Asher are childhood friends, I won't interfere if that's what you want. But why resort to violence?" She cried out at me, "Just because I'm from a poor family. Because my background isn't as good as yours, you think you can trample on me like this?" I couldn't control myself, trembling with anger. I raised my hand to slap her back, but Asher grabbed my wrist. "Aileen." He looked at me as if I were a stranger. "You need to learn a lesson too." As soon as he finished speaking, he threw me to the ground. I watched their retreating figures and spoke softly. "Asher. These 10 years, I might as well have befriended a dog. But this incident won't end here." In the dim moonlight, his figure paused for a moment, but he never looked back once. The path was too secluded, with no CCTV cameras installed. Moreover, those 3 girls would never voluntarily admit to assaulting me. I was left defenseless against their accusations. After a long while, I finally got up from the ground and silently walked towards the dormitory. When I reached the building, Asher was standing under a streetlight, looking displeased. My gaze didn't linger on him for even a second as I continued walking. Asher, however, stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. "Get lost," I said weakly. He forcefully placed the ointment he was holding into my hand. Then, he raised his hand, intending to touch my cheek where a red mark was visible. I turned my head away to avoid his touch. He frowned, pressing his lips together tightly. "You left Fiona in such a state, I only allowed her to return one slap. Aileen, stop being difficult with me." As soon as he finished speaking, Asher's phone rang. When he answered, I clearly heard an affected voice on the other end. "Asher, my wound hurts so much. Can you come and stay with me?" Asher hung up the phone and immediately started to leave. After taking a few steps, he seemed to suddenly remember me and turned back to look. With a gentle expression, he reassured me. "Remember to apply the ointment when you get back. Didn't you mention wanting to try that new pizza shop outside campus? I'll take you tomorrow." He appeared to be in a hurry and ran off without waiting for my response. I lowered my gaze to look at the ointment in my hand. Loosening my grip slightly, the ointment fell to the ground. I didn't even glance at it as I walked away, sidestepping him. I had once wanted to drag Asher along to try that pizza shop with me. But he had impatiently refused. He said, "Can't you go by yourself? My schedule is packed almost every day." Later, when I decided to go alone, I saw him through the shop window, sitting down at a table with Fiona. He said he was busy, but he was willing to make time for Fiona. I never went to that pizza shop again. Now, I no longer want to go at all. And Asher probably just said it offhandedly. The next day, he didn't come to find me. Surprisingly, I felt relieved. Asher constantly used my parents' situation to manipulate me, like an overwhelming mountain, making it hard to breathe. But even if I couldn't confront Asher, I could still deal with Fiona. That day, I happened to have class on the floor above Fiona. After class, I dragged her to a secluded spot and swiftly slapped her twice. Yes, I hit you. What are you going to do about it? Call the police? I took out my phone, dialed 999, and held it out to her. Aren't you afraid I'll tell Asher again? She clutched her face, glaring at me intently. Go ahead, I said. Even if you call him here, he won't lay a hand on me. He'll just let you hit me instead. There are cameras here. I hit you, and I can pay compensation. Can you? As you said, you can barely scrape together your tuition fees. Moreover, she wouldn't dare bother Asher too many times. She was afraid he would lose patience with her. Without him, she would have no one to rely on at the school. Fiona stared at me intensely, her gaze filled with resentment. I let out a cold laugh and turned to leave. I thought that would be the end of it. But I had momentarily forgotten about her vindictive nature. When I found myself trapped in a burning building, gasping for air, I truly regretted, for a split second, my decision to slap her that day. That day, I was assisting my senior in the chemistry lab. He went to another building to fetch some materials, leaving me to tidy up. This building hadn't been renovated for ages, the windows and doors were all problematic. I was covering the spirit lamp when Fiona came in, closing the door behind her. You spread those rumors, didn't you? I wasn't in the mood to entertain her baseless accusations. I just irritably glanced towards the door. The lock's broken. Once you close it, you can't open it from inside. She seemed to ignore me completely, staring at me intently. Now everyone's slagging me off. Are you happy? I'd heard about the recent rumors about Fiona, claiming she was after someone else's boyfriend. Honestly, she must have known that those 3 girls from that night were the prime suspects. But she didn't dare confront those troublemakers. So she came to take it out on me instead. I laughed bitterly. Paranoid much? Fiona, stop coming here to debase yourself every time. It's Asher's business if he pampers you, but if you push me too far, I'm capable of anything. I won't let you off easy. Fiona bit her lip hard, almost drawing blood. I paused, suddenly realizing she seemed to have lost her mind. While I was still stunned, she abruptly walked up to me and shoved me hard. Caught off guard, I stumbled backwards, knocking over the spirit lamp. 3 unextinguished lamps collided and burst, igniting sparks. They splashed onto the nearby curtains. The window was rickety, with large gaps. Fanned by the dry, cold wind, the flames spread instantly. I was too late to stop it. In a flash, the fire engulfed the entire curtain and quickly raged outwards. Ah! The door was right next to the window. Fiona and I were forced to retreat to opposite corners of the room, with me in the front corner. She ran to the farthest corner to hide. We were separated by 2 tables. Some flammable items must have been stored under the tables. A tiny spark set them ablaze, quickly spreading across the entire table, forming a waist-high wall of fire. Trembling, I pulled out my phone and forced myself to call 999 despite my fear. Fiona was scared too. She immediately called Asher. The black smoke billowing from the window drew quite a crowd outside. They either called the fire brigade or went to find a tutor. No one dared come up. Except Asher. But the fire was already out of control. Asher! I'm here! Fiona shouted immediately. I locked eyes with Asher through the flames. Asher, save me! Instinctively, I begged for help, forgetting all our past grievances. I was terrified too. I didn't want to die. Fiona was still far from the flames, she had plenty of time. But the burning light fixture above my head was about to fall. Asher. For the sake of our 10-year friendship, just this once. Just this once, save me first. The lock had warped in the heat, completely jammed. Unless someone broke down the door. Asher! I'm so scared! Fiona cried. Asher snapped back to reality, looking at me intently. Aileen, hold on a moment. With that, he ran towards the back door. He chose to save Fiona first. When the burning light fixture crashed down, I couldn't dodge it. As I lay there dying, I saw Asher carrying Fiona away. This was the third time he'd abandoned me. I woke up in pain, lying face down on the hospital bed to avoid putting pressure on the wounds on my back. Asher was sitting by my bed with his eyes closed. As soon as I moved slightly, he immediately woke up. Aileen. Asher carefully helped me sit up. He crouched in front of me, his face showing signs of fatigue, but still managed to force a placating smile. Do you want some water, or are you in pain? I'll call the doctor for you. Where are my parents? My voice was particularly hoarse from not speaking for so long. The acquisition deal is at a critical stage, so they couldn't get away. I told them I'd stay at the hospital to look after you. I stared silently at Asher for a long while. Asher, I had a dream. I dreamt about that earthquake when we were in year 4. I was trapped in the crowd and couldn't escape. But you fought your way through the bustling throng to grab my hand and lead me out of the school building. There were several times I almost got pushed out of the crowd, but you held onto my hand tightly and never let go. After that day, I considered you one of the most important people in my life. The color visibly drained from Asher's face. His lips trembled as he reached for my hand. I'm sorry. Aileen, I'm so sorry, it's all my fault. I didn't let him touch me, but continued speaking in a calm tone. At the end of the day, you didn't have any obligation to save me first. There's nothing wrong with saving the person you care about most. But Asher, I can't just let it go. He seemed unable to find words to argue, just looking at me helplessly. I spoke again, settling our final score. That night, I didn't hit Fiona once, whether you believe it or not. You believed her word without any evidence, and I took an undeserved slap for it. I've since paid her back, and now I'm paying you back too. With that, I slowly raised my hand, the movement causing some pain in my back. I pressed my slightly chapped lips together, feeling utterly indifferent. I slapped him. He took it without flinching, then looked at me with an expression I found extremely hypocritical. The obvious regret and concern in his eyes made me nauseous. Be careful not to strain your back. I gave a mocking smile. Get out. Asher, don't ever show your face to me again. This time, even threatening me with my parents won't work. Before Asher could speak, a voice from the doorway interrupted. Aileen, if you're feeling better, could I trouble you to stay away from my boyfriend? He's not obligated to take care of you. Fiona stood at the door, giving me a strained smile. So they were together now. Asher looked at me, opening and closing his mouth. He seemed to want to explain something, but fell silent after a moment. Fiona. I smiled. Take your boyfriend and leave. Looking at you two for even a second longer makes me sick. Also, I looked at the girl who appeared pure as a lily on the outside but was rotten to the core. Meeting her eyes in the dim light. People should take responsibility for their actions, don't you think? The fact that she could stand here confronting me now proved that the school hadn't had time, or enough evidence, to investigate the lab fire incident. Although the cameras inside the lab were destroyed, there was one in the corridor facing the door. It would have captured at least part of what happened. At the very least, it would show that Fiona attacked first, causing me to knock over the spirit lamp. She couldn't escape that. It was clear she must have tampered with the evidence. I lowered my gaze to Fiona's shadow on the floor. She visibly trembled. Fiona, are you afraid too? Asher still came to visit for the first few days, but I didn't let him into the hospital room. I can't remember which day it was when he stopped appearing altogether. The scars on my back began to grow new flesh. Every night, my back would start to ache and itch. It tormented me so much that I could barely fall asleep until dawn. Fiona might have forgotten, or perhaps she didn't take my warning seriously at all. That night, as I was trying hard not to scratch the new flesh on my back, my forehead slightly damp with sweat, the phone by my pillow suddenly lit up. I unlocked it and opened the text message. It was a photo sent from an unknown number. Asher was holding Fiona in his arms, bending down to kiss her. To be honest, emotions like jealousy and envy had long since dissipated. But Fiona's blatant provocation had thoroughly angered me. Someone ought to pay the price now. However, before I could confront them, Asher appeared before me again. I had called my parents to say I was going back to school to pack some things. as I'd be recovering at home for a while. Little did I know that Asher was with them at the time and overheard the conversation. He took it upon himself to go to my dormitory and pack my things. That's when he discovered my diary. It contained records of every little detail since I first fell for Asher at 17. Asher stumbled into my house. The usually well-mannered young man ignored the housekeeper's greeting this time. He pushed open the door to my room, his eyes red as he looked at me. In his hand was that notebook. All my embarrassment was instantly exposed. But it was only for a moment before I quickly calmed down. The veins on Asher's hand, gripping the notebook, were bulging prominently. "You've liked me since you were 17? He gazed at me intensely, his eyes complex. I met his gaze and simply said, "But I stopped liking you the first time you abandoned me at the oceanarium. And it was completely exhausted the last time you left me in the fire." I blinked, my eyes stinging a little. It was merely sadness for this quietly fallen girlhood crush. "I didn't know." His voice was hoarse. Asher walked over step by step, kneeling by my bed, frowning pensively, muttering to himself. "I never noticed. Even when desperately hidden, fervent love will escape through one's eyes. But you never paid attention to my eyes. Your eyes were full of Fiona." I no longer cared to complain to him. "Don't put on that act, Asher Beaumont. You and Fiona Hawthorne are good together. Too perfect." Asher suddenly looked up, shaking his head with a bitter smile. "I probably don't like her that much. After that time she was hit, I started to have some doubts. It felt like she was different from when I first knew her." In Asher's eyes, Fiona was pure, gentle, and innocent. But when Fiona slapped me, it exposed her vindictive true nature. Asher's rose-tinted glasses for her began to crack. Once the girl he admired did something he didn't like, he immediately lost interest. "See? He's not such a good person either." And the reason he was still willing to be with Fiona was simply because he still had expectations for his little white flower. The filter just hadn't completely shattered yet. That day, Asher looked at me for a long time with an extremely complex gaze. No matter how harshly I spoke, he accepted it all. In the end, he just left an ambiguous sentence. Asher leaned against the doorframe, smiling bitterly. "Aileen, what should I do? I seem to have gotten so many things wrong." I had no obligation to answer him and was focused on getting him to leave. Asher waved my diary, asking in a low voice, "I haven't finished reading it yet. Can I borrow it for a couple more days?" I didn't care, it's just rubbish. "Even if you return it to me, I'll throw it away. A record of one's love for a piece of trash is also trash." He looked down at the notebook, contradicting very softly. "It's not. After my scars had healed, I returned to school. Everything I had suffered without reason deserved an explanation. Fiona told Asher that I had hit her. Whether Asher believed it or not, I no longer cared. I didn't need to prove my innocence to him either. But I couldn't let the slap I received for no reason go unanswered. I sought out the girl who had hit Fiona Hawthorne that day. The enemy of my enemy may not become a friend. But she could become a temporary ally. She provided me with the information I wanted. At the same time, she told me without hesitation that she was indeed the one who had spread the rumors about Fiona initially. This girl spoke quite crudely. She even used words like bus to describe Fiona. According to her, Fiona had indeed been flirting with many boys, but had recently cut ties with them all. Probably because she was officially dating Asher now. Asher disappeared for several days. It wasn't until a week later that I saw him together with Fiona Hawthorne. I'm not sure if it was my imagination, but Asher looked completely dispirited. Moreover, my gaze fixed on the crimson at his fingertips. This was the first time I had seen him smoke. Fiona made a move to hug him, but he dodged her, so she had to settle for holding his hand instead. I stood in the shadows not far away, taking a picture of the scene and sending it to several unknown numbers. One of them belonged to the boyfriend of the girl who had hit Fiona. Fiona had admitted at the time that the reason she was hit was because she had been flirting with this boy. He was from a neighboring school. The rest were also boys who had had ambiguous relationships with Fiona. In about half an hour, 3 of them arrived. From initial verbal confrontations, it gradually escalated to someone getting emotional and pushing. One even slapped Fiona. The slap from a burly boy over 6 feet tall sent Fiona straight to the ground. She even had a nosebleed. Asher remained a cold observer throughout, only slightly frowning when Fiona was hit. More and more people gathered around, including some busybodies who secretly recorded videos and posted them on Twitter and the school's online forum. Fiona's reputation was ruined. At the same time, it came to light that while the camera outside the lab had clearly recorded everything, there was no archived footage of the incident. One of the boys she had been involved with studied computer science. He had pursued Fiona for half a year with no progress until this incident occurred. Fiona used the promise of a relationship as leverage, persuading him to risk breaking the law by hacking into the school's surveillance system and transferring the video from that time. Yes, transferred, not deleted. The boy had been cautious, worried that Fiona might betray him, so he kept this as evidence. Unexpectedly, before she could turn on him, everything fell apart. The boy finally saw her true colors and voluntarily confessed what had happened, handing over the video footage intact. Considering his voluntary confession, he was only detained for a few days for criticism and education. But Fiona wasn't so lucky. Someone compiled a list of her various misdeeds and exposed them on Twitter. The situation continued to escalate, attracting a certain degree of social attention. Deliberately interfering in others' relationships, juggling multiple boys at once, and most importantly, breaking the law. The calls for Fiona's expulsion grew louder and louder. In the end, the school administration couldn't withstand the pressure. Before Fiona was taken away by the police, they tactfully persuaded her to withdraw from school. She had once been proud of her ability to attract so many boys, but in the end, it led to her downfall. Before leaving, Fiona went to see Asher one last time, which I happened to witness. She clutched his sleeve, sobbing quietly. "Please don't break up with me. I never liked any of those boys, and nothing happened between us. I only like you, you're the only one I've fallen for." But Asher just coldly pulled his sleeve away. "Fiona, I don't think I like you." His words stunned her. Asher lowered his eyes, his voice indifferent. "To be honest, when I found out about all this, I didn't have much of an emotional reaction. I always thought my ideal partner would be a pure and gentle girl. Yes, you fit that description perfectly, and I thought I liked you. But recently, I've realized I was wrong about a lot of things. Whether or not all this had happened, I was planning to break up with you anyway. I'm sorry for letting you misunderstand for so long." With each sentence Asher spoke, Fiona's face grew paler. Even after Asher left, she remained standing there. Her sobs grew louder, her expression of pain seemed genuine. Fiona ultimately reaped what she sowed. She had played with the feelings of so many boys, only to fall for someone who didn't like her in the end. Later, Asher accidentally learned the truth about Fiona being beaten up. Without me taking the initiative, he appeared in front of me on his own. He cornered me at the entrance of the dormitory building. "I misunderstood you, Aileen. I was wrong." Then he unexpectedly grabbed my hand and tried to make me slap his face. I frowned and pulled my hand back. "Are you mad?" He still stared at me obsessively. "You can slap me as many times as you want." He pursed his lips and added in a low voice, "As long as you can forgive me." "That's impossible," I rejected him completely. "Asher Beaumont, the damage you've done to me is irreversible. Although the scars on my back aren't directly related to you. Every time the weather changes and they itch, I'm reminded of how you abandoned me that day." I smiled self-mockingly. I really can't let it go. I pushed Asher aside and walked away. But his voice sounded again from behind. "Aileen Sterling. I know saying this now will only make you dislike me more, but I still have to say it. I've been reading your notebook over and over during this time, recalling everything between us based on what you wrote. Those moments when you fell for me, I actually felt the same, but I didn't understand it before. I thought it was just special care for a sister." He spoke without much confidence, yet with excessive clarity. "I actually fell in love with you long ago, I just didn't realize it." "No, you didn't. No one likes someone else that way. You just feel guilty and regretful towards me, and you're touched after knowing I've liked you for so many years. The mixed emotions make you mistakenly think it's love. But I didn't want to get entangled with him anymore. I acted as if I hadn't heard anything, continuing to walk away without stopping or looking back. However, Asher was particularly persistent. The former golden boy seemed to have a late rebellious phase. He abandoned his studies and started indulging in bars, always carrying a pack of cigarettes in his bag. That day, I was dragged to the sports field by my roommate. Seeing the elaborately decorated confession scene and most people's gazes focused on me, I finally realized belatedly. I was the one being confessed to. And the junior who was confessing to me, I barely had any impression of him. He held a large bouquet of Bulgarian roses, seeming a bit flushed as he stuttered through his confession to me. The cheering from the crowd grew louder and louder. I choked on my words of rejection. If I rejected him now, it would be too embarrassing for him, wouldn't it? I looked at the flowers in front of me with difficulty, hesitating to raise my hand. When I was suddenly grabbed forcefully by the wrist. I was dragged to a secluded corner. Asher reeked of alcohol, but his eyes were particularly clear and cold. He gripped my wrist so tightly it hurt, giving me no chance to struggle. His gaze locked onto me as he spoke particularly harsh words. Aileen, don't tell me you're planning to accept him. Have you changed your heart so quickly? Can you just let go of your so-called love for me that easily? The moment he finished his last word, I slapped him without hesitation. Bastard. Asher tilted his head slightly, rubbing his cheek and letting out a cold sneer. He moved his hand and pulled me in front of him. Our noses were almost touching. Aileen, what do I have to do for you to forgive me? Tell me, I'll do anything for you. The corners of his eyes were red, slightly teary. His words were the most humble, but his actions remained overbearing and obsessive. Please, Aileen, don't do this to me. Looking at the boy in front of me who was so different from before, I calmed down again. Asher, you abandoned me 3 times for Fiona Hawthorne. If you can make those 3 times never happen, I'll forgive you. There was a deep chasm between Asher and me. And his attempts to build bridges across it were completely in vain. He looked at me dejectedly, with no room for rebuttal. I finally freed my hand from his grip. Without waiting for his response, I turned and left. After walking a distance, I suddenly remembered something and looked back. Asher was still standing there, watching the direction I had left. It seemed that ever since he discovered that notebook, everything had been reversed. The one left behind had become him. But I didn't feel happy about this. Instead, I felt tired and annoyed by his persistence. This winter seemed particularly long. Around the holiday break, my parents' acquisition deal was also wrapping up. We were going to move out of our original villa. Finally, I could be further away from Asher. At last, I found something to be happy about. I was even so happy that I didn't notice when he suddenly stopped appearing around me. Until I received a call from Asher's mom. She was crying uncontrollably. Aileen, can you come see Asher? I really don't know what to do anymore. Asher was injured. Burns. Mrs. Beaumont told me that 2 weeks ago, Asher was passing by an apartment building. A fire broke out in one of the flats on the 3rd floor. A girl was trapped inside and couldn't get out. The fire brigade hadn't arrived yet. He rushed in like a madman and rescued her, but severely burned his entire arm in the process. Aileen, Asher has always felt guilty about not being able to rescue you from the fire in time. He must have thought of you, which is why he risked his life to save a stranger. Mrs. Beaumont's tone was pleading. Please help me, come see Asher. I hated Asher, but I couldn't ignore Mrs. Beaumont who had always been kind to me. Seeing Asher again, I felt extremely conflicted. He was half leaning against the headboard, looking weak and dejected. Aileen, I finally understand now. It really hurts. The scars extended from his arm all the way to his neck. Asher gave a faint smile. The first few days, I couldn't sleep at night because of the pain. Later, when it finally started healing, it began to itch incessantly. Like countless worms crawling on my arm. Yes, that's how it was for me back then too. Sometimes I think, I might as well just chop it off. He looked at his arm, speaking in a calm tone as if he really intended to do it. I tiredly rubbed my brow and sighed. Asher, stop doing these self-gratifying things. Even if you save thousands of people trapped in fires, it has nothing to do with me. Can you make my scars never exist in the first place? Then what should I do, Aileen? He stared at me blankly. Tell me, what should I do? I looked at the sunlight outside the window, seemingly feeling a hint of warmth. After a few seconds of contemplation, I slowly spoke. Asher, shouldn't liking someone make them happy? My gaze shifted back to meet his eyes. But your actions don't make me happy at all. They're actually very troubling. This kind of affection is too warped. If you keep going on like this, I might have to consider taking a break from school to avoid you. I shouldn't have to pay for your regrets. When he heard me mention taking a break from school, his body stiffened almost imperceptibly. His hand unconsciously gripped the blanket. Asher lowered his eyes and nodded. I won't bother you anymore in the future. I'll try my best not to appear in front of you. Aileen, can you not take a break from school? He seemed to have lowered himself to dust, asking cautiously. I didn't like seeing him like this. It gave me the feeling that he was the victim. I turned my gaze away without answering. I only emphasized one last time before leaving. Really, don't come disturb me again. Asher, I understand. It wasn't until I walked out of the Beaumont family villa that I let out a deep breath. The inexplicable frustration in my chest dissipated along with it. The warm midday sun shone gently on me, melting away some of the coldness. I reached out my hand to feel the temperature. The last trace of biting cold was about to vanish. This winter. It seemed like it was finally coming to an end.